I never thought the person who'd try to kill me wouldn't be some stranger in the night, but my own daughter-in-law. When she shoved me into that lake, I saw the truth clearer than ever. Greed had hollowed her out completely. And all for money she never earned, $3.1 billion that had my name written on it, not hers. My name is Margaret Whitmore, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 68 years old, and I'm telling you this story because what happened to me could happen to anyone. Family isn't always blood, and sometimes the people closest to you are the ones plotting your demise. Before I continue, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing where my stories reach around the world. It reminds me that no matter where we are, we all face the same struggles with betrayal and greed. Make sure you subscribe to join us for more stories like this one. These aren't just entertainment, they're warnings, lessons from those of us who've survived the unthinkable. Subscribe if you believe in fairness and justice, because only those who don't believe in fairness would refuse to hear what happened next. And trust me, what happened next will shock you to your core. It shocked me and I lived through it. You see, I spent my entire life believing that if you treat people with kindness and respect, they'll return the favor. I believed that family meant something sacred, something unbreakable. I believed that the woman my son married would love him enough to respect the woman who raised him. I was wrong on all counts. But to understand how my own family tried to erase me for billions, how a woman I welcomed into my home with open arms eventually stood on a dock watching me struggle for my life in freezing water. You need to know how this all started. You need to know who I was before that terrible day, and who she was before she revealed her true nature. Because the signs were there all along. I just chose to ignore them, hoping love could conquer greed. That choice nearly cost me everything. I need to start at the beginning. Back when life made sense and family meant something sacred. My name is Margaret Whitmore, but like I said, everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 68 years old, silver-haired, and what people might call a retired businesswoman, though retirement never really felt like the right word. When you've spent 43 years building something from nothing, you don't just stop caring about it overnight. I'm also a widow, a grandmother of 3 beautiful children, and someone who believed wholeheartedly in the power of hard work and family loyalty. For most of my adult life, I poured my heart and soul into Whitmore Textiles alongside my late husband, Robert. God, I miss that man. We started with absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing. We had $17 between us, a rented sewing machine, and a dream that probably seemed foolish to everyone around us. Those early years were brutal. I'm talking about nights where dinner was ramen noodles for the 3rd time that week, where we'd work until our fingers bled, where unpaid bills stacked up like autumn leaves. Robert would fall asleep at his desk, and I'd cover him with a blanket before heading home to our tiny 1-bedroom apartment. We weren't just building a business, we were building a legacy, though we didn't know it then. We were just 2 people who refused to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. The factory finally turned profitable in our 7th year. I'll never forget the day we made our first real profit. Not just breaking even, but actually making money. Robert picked me up and spun me around that cramped office until I was dizzy and laughing. That's when we knew we had something special. That's when we knew all those years of sacrifice had been worth it. But the real growth came from our investments. While other textile companies were content with steady profits, Robert and I saw opportunities everywhere. We invested in emerging markets, diversified into real estate, put money into technology stocks before anyone really understood what the internet would become. We weren't gamblers, we were strategic. Every decision was calculated, researched, discussed over countless cups of coffee at our kitchen table. By the time Robert passed away 15 years ago, Whitmore Textiles had grown into something neither of us could have imagined in those early days. $3.1 billion. That number still takes my breath away sometimes. It represents decades of 18-hour days, missed vacations, sacrificed weekends, and unwavering determination. When Robert died, I became the sole steward of that wealth, and I took that responsibility seriously. But here's the thing about me. I've always been family-oriented. Money means nothing if you don't have people to share your life with. I'm the type of woman who brings casseroles to neighbors when they're sick, who remembers every birthday and anniversary, who makes sure family dinners happen every Sunday without fail. I send handwritten thank you notes. I know my mailman's name, and I've never forgotten where I came from. Don't mistake my kindness for weakness, though. You don't build $1 billion empire by being a pushover. I spent my entire adult life fighting off corporate sharks, negotiating with suppliers who thought they could take advantage of a woman, and making tough decisions that affected hundreds of employees. I know greed when I see it. I can spot manipulation from a mile away, and I'm not afraid to stand my ground when something matters to me. My current life was everything I'd worked toward. Every morning, I'd wake up in the house Robert and I built together, make my coffee in the kitchen where we'd plan our future, and start my day with purpose. I served on the boards of 3 different charities, personally reviewing grant applications and visiting the communities we supported. I managed my investments carefully, always thinking about the long-term impact on our employees and their families. But my greatest joy was my family. My son Andrew, my 3 grandchildren, and the Sunday dinners that brought us all together around the same dining room table where Robert and I had made our first business plans. I wasn't the type of grandmother who spoiled the children with expensive gifts, but I made sure they knew they were loved. I helped with homework, attended every school play and soccer game, and told them stories about their grandfather who'd worked so hard to give them opportunities. Then Vanessa entered our lives, and everything started to change. She came into our family about 10 years ago, when Andrew was 32 and completely smitten. I have to admit, I understood why. Vanessa was stunning in that polished, magazine cover way that turns heads wherever she goes. Long, dark hair that always looked professionally styled, a smile that could light up any room, and the kind of natural charisma that made everyone want to be around her. But there was something underneath that perfection that made me uneasy from the start. You know how some people have warmth that radiates outward, making everyone feel welcome? Vanessa had the opposite. A coldness that she covered with charm, like a beautiful winter coat hiding ice underneath. I never thought the person who'd try to kill me wouldn't be some stranger in the night, but my own daughter-in-law. When she shoved me into that lake, I saw the truth clearer than ever. Greed had hollowed her out completely. And all for money she never earned, $3.1 billion that had my name written on it, not hers. My name is Margaret Whitmore, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 68 years old, and I'm telling you this story because what happened to me could happen to anyone. Family isn't always blood, and sometimes the people closest to you are the ones plotting your demise. Before I continue, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing where my stories reach around the world. It reminds me that no matter where we are, we all face the same struggles with betrayal and greed. Make sure you subscribe to join us for more stories like this one. These aren't just entertainment, they're warnings, lessons from those of us who've survived the unthinkable. Subscribe if you believe in fairness and justice, because only those who don't believe in fairness would refuse to hear what happened next. And trust me, what happened next will shock you to your core. It shocked me and I lived through it. You see, I spent my entire life believing that if you treat people with kindness and respect, they'll return the favor. I believed that family meant something sacred, something unbreakable. I believed that the woman my son married would love him enough to respect the woman who raised him. I was wrong on all counts. But to understand how my own family tried to erase me for billions, how a woman I welcomed into my home with open arms eventually stood on a dock watching me struggle for my life in freezing water. You need to know how this all started. You need to know who I was before that terrible day, and who she was before she revealed her true nature. Because the signs were there all along. I just chose to ignore them, hoping love could conquer greed. That choice nearly cost me everything. I need to start at the beginning, back when life made sense and family meant something sacred. My name is Margaret Whitmore, but like I said, everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 68 years old, silver-haired, and what people might call a retired businesswoman, though retirement never really felt like the right word. When you've spent 43 years building something from nothing, you don't just stop caring about it overnight. I'm also a widow, a grandmother of 3 beautiful children, and someone who believed wholeheartedly in the power of hard work and family loyalty. For most of my adult life, I poured my heart and soul into Whitmore Textiles alongside my late husband, Robert. God, I miss that man. We started with absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing. We had $17 between us, a rented sewing machine, and a dream that probably seemed foolish to everyone around us. Those early years were brutal. I'm talking about nights where dinner was ramen noodles for the third time that week, where we'd work until our fingers bled, where unpaid bills stacked up like autumn leaves. Robert would fall asleep at his desk, and I'd cover him with a blanket before heading home to our tiny one-bedroom apartment. We weren't just building a business, we were building a legacy, though we didn't know it then. We were just two people who refused to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. The factory finally turned profitable in our 7th year. I'll never forget the day we made our first real profit. Not just breaking even, but actually making money. Robert picked me up and spun me around that cramped office until I was dizzy and laughing. That's when we knew we had something special. That's when we knew all those years of sacrifice had been worth it. But the real growth came from our investments. While other textile companies were content with steady profits, Robert and I saw opportunities everywhere. We invested in emerging markets, diversified into real estate, put money into technology stocks before anyone really understood what the internet would become. We weren't gamblers, we were strategic. Every decision was calculated, researched, discussed over countless cups of coffee at our kitchen table. By the time Robert passed away 15 years ago, Whitmore Textiles had grown into something neither of us could have imagined in those early days. $3.1 billion. That number still takes my breath away sometimes. It represents decades of 18-hour days, missed vacations, sacrificed weekends, and unwavering determination. When Robert died, I became the sole steward of that wealth, and I took that responsibility seriously. But here's the thing about me. I've always been family-oriented. Money means nothing if you don't have people to share your life with. I'm the type of woman who brings casseroles to neighbors when they're sick, who remembers every birthday and anniversary, who makes sure family dinners happen every Sunday without fail. I send handwritten thank you notes. I know my mailman's name, and I've never forgotten where I came from. Don't mistake my kindness for weakness, though. You don't build a billion-dollar empire by being a pushover. I spent my entire adult life fighting off corporate sharks, negotiating with suppliers who thought they could take advantage of a woman, and making tough decisions that affected hundreds of employees. I know greed when I see it. I can spot manipulation from a mile away, and I'm not afraid to stand my ground when something matters to me. My current life was everything I'd worked toward. Every morning, I'd wake up in the house Robert and I built together, make my coffee in the kitchen where we'd plan our future, and start my day with purpose. I served on the boards of 3 different charities, personally reviewing grant applications and visiting the communities we supported. I managed my investments carefully, always thinking about the long-term impact on our employees and their families. But my greatest joy was my family. My son Andrew, my 3 grandchildren, and the Sunday dinners that brought us all together around the same dining room table where Robert and I had made our first business plans. I wasn't the type of grandmother who spoiled the children with expensive gifts, but I made sure they knew they were loved. I helped with homework, attended every school play and soccer game, and told them stories about their grandfather who'd worked so hard to give them opportunities. Then Vanessa entered our lives, and everything started to change. She came into our family about 10 years ago, when Andrew was 32 and completely smitten. I have to admit, I understood why. Vanessa was stunning in that polished, magazine cover way that turns heads wherever she goes. Long, dark hair that always looked professionally styled, a smile that could light up any room, and the kind of natural charisma that made everyone want to be around her. But there was something underneath that perfection that made me uneasy from the start. You know how some people have warmth that radiates outward, making everyone feel welcome? Vanessa had the opposite. A coldness that she covered with charm, like a beautiful winter coat hiding ice underneath. But even my relationship with my grandchildren became strained as Vanessa's influence grew. She'd make subtle comments about how I was filling their heads with old-fashioned ideas or confusing them with too much responsibility talk. She wanted them to see money as something to be enjoyed rather than something to be stewarded carefully. The red flags were there from the beginning. growing more obvious as the years passed. Vanessa would make comments about how the estate was decorated in an outdated style that needed modern updating. She critiqued my charitable choices, suggesting I was wasting money on ungrateful people instead of investing in family. She'd talk about vacation homes we should buy, luxury cars that would better represent our status, social events we should host to network with the right people. Every conversation revealed more of her true nature. She saw the Whitmore fortune as a vehicle for her own social climbing, a way to achieve the lifestyle she felt entitled to without having to earn it herself. The idea that this money came with responsibilities, with connections to employees and communities and charitable causes, never seemed to occur to her. To Vanessa, $3 billion was just $3 billion to be spent on whatever she wanted. I caught her snooping through my study multiple times. The first time, I found her going through papers on my desk, rifling through legal documents as if she were hunting for something specific. When I asked what she was doing, she laughed it off, saying she was just curious about how you organize everything. But her face had gone pale when she heard my footsteps, and she'd been shuffling papers back into their folders with nervous energy. The second time, I found her photographing documents with her phone. Legal documents, investment statements, anything that might give her insight into the structure of our finances. When confronted, she claimed she was trying to learn more about financial management and thought these might be educational examples. But she deleted the photos immediately when I asked to see them, which told me everything I needed to know about her real intentions. Each incident made my unease grow stronger. This wasn't casual curiosity about family finances. This was systematic intelligence gathering, the kind of behavior you'd expect from someone planning something specific. But planning what? And why did she need information she wasn't entitled to have? Andrew's distance from me became more pronounced during this period. Vanessa had a talent for scheduling conflicts whenever I wanted to spend time with my son. Family dinners became less frequent. Holiday celebrations got shortened or moved to accommodate her social calendar. When I called to chat, he'd often cut conversations short because Vanessa needed him for something urgent that never seemed quite as urgent as she claimed. I started to feel like a stranger in my own family, watching from the outside as my son's wife gradually took control of his attention, his time, his priorities. She was isolating him systematically, creating an us versus them dynamic where I was increasingly the outsider. Then came my 68th birthday and everything changed. I had planned a quiet family celebration, nothing elaborate. Just dinner at home with Andrew, Vanessa, and the grandchildren. During dessert, I made an announcement that I'd been considering for months. I was going to establish trust funds for each of my grandchildren, ensuring their futures would be secure without spoiling them. The money would be available for education, for starting businesses, for buying homes, but it would come with guidelines about responsibility and giving back to the community. I explained that this was how I wanted to begin transitioning our wealth to the next generation, thoughtfully, with safeguards in place, with education about the responsibilities that come with financial privilege. The children were excited, asking questions about how it would work and what it meant for their futures. But Vanessa's reaction was completely different. Her face fell the moment she realized the money wasn't going straight into Andrew's and her bank account. She tried to hide her disappointment, but I saw the flash of anger in her eyes, the tightness around her smile. This wasn't what she'd been planning for, and she was struggling to contain her frustration. After dinner, she cornered me in the kitchen while I was putting away dishes. The children were playing in the living room. Andrew was on a work call, and we were alone for the first time all evening. That's when her mask slipped completely. "You're being selfish," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but dripping with venom. "You've lived your life. That money should be ours now, not locked away in some trust fund with strings attached. You're punishing us for no reason." Her words hit me like a physical blow. This woman, who had never worked a day in her life, who had never contributed a single dollar to the fortune she felt entitled to, was calling me selfish for trying to protect my grandchildren's futures. She wasn't concerned about their education or their character development. She was angry that I wasn't simply writing her a check for billions of dollars. That money should be ours now. The phrase echoed in my mind for hours after she said it. Not Andrew's money, not the children's money, Ours. As if she had somehow earned the right to it. As if 43 years of my blood, sweat, and tears belonged to her by virtue of marrying my son. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed replaying every interaction we'd had, every comment she'd made about the family finances, every time I'd caught her going through papers in my study. The unease I'd felt for years crystallized into genuine fear. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, about power, about a woman who felt entitled to erase my legacy and replace it with her own vision. The snooping incidents became more frequent after that confrontation. I'd find papers moved in my study, files accessed on my computer, legal documents photographed when she thought I wasn't looking. She was gathering information systematically, building a picture of our financial structure, learning about vulnerabilities she might be able to exploit. When I confronted her about going through my will, she had the audacity to say she was just curious about family planning and wanted to understand how these things work. But there was nothing curious or educational about the way she was documenting our private financial information. This was reconnaissance for some larger plan I couldn't quite see yet. Andrew became even more distant during this period. Vanessa had apparently told him about our kitchen confrontation, though I'm sure her version painted me as an unreasonable old woman who was being unnecessarily controlling with the family money. He started treating me differently, more carefully, as if he were afraid I might cut him off financially if he said something wrong. The Sunday dinners that had been the cornerstone of our family life became strained and uncomfortable. Vanessa would make passive-aggressive comments about my hoarding money that could be making everyone's life better. She'd talk about renovations she wanted to make to update the estate for modern living. She'd discuss vacation homes and luxury purchases, as if they were inevitable future purchases, rather than her personal wish list. I felt like I was living with an enemy who was pretending to be family, someone who was systematically working to undermine everything Robert and I had built together. But every time I tried to talk to Andrew about my concerns, he'd defend her, dismiss my worries as paranoia, suggest that maybe I was having trouble adjusting to not being the center of the family anymore. That phrase stung more than he probably realized. I had never wanted to be the center of anything. I had just wanted to be respected as the person who had earned the right to make decisions about the money I had helped create. I wanted my son to understand that his wife was measuring our family by the weight of our bank account rather than the strength of our relationships. The tension in our house became almost unbearable. I'd find Vanessa watching me sometimes, studying me as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. Her smiles became more forced, her compliments more hollow, her patience for family traditions more strained. She was done pretending to care about our history, our values, our way of doing things. She wanted access to the money, and I was the obstacle standing in her way. Then came that Sunday afternoon that changed everything forever. Vanessa approached me with unusual sweetness, suggesting we take a walk together down to the lake behind our house. Andrew was conveniently busy with work in his office. The grandchildren were at their other grandmother's house, and it would just be the two of us. She seemed almost excited about the prospect of spending time together, complimenting my scarf, asking about my health, acting like the caring daughter-in-law she'd never actually been. I should have known something was wrong. Vanessa had never suggested we spend time alone together, had never shown genuine interest in my well-being, had never been anything but politely distant when we were away from Andrew's watchful eyes. But I wanted so desperately to believe that maybe, finally, we could find some common ground. Maybe she was ready to have an honest conversation about the family, about the money, about our future together. We walked slowly toward the dock, her arm linked through mine in a gesture of intimacy that felt completely foreign between us. She talked about how beautiful the property was, how peaceful the lake looked in the afternoon sunlight, how lucky we were to have such a private retreat from the world. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to hope that this might be a turning point in our relationship. But as we reached the end of the dock, her tone shifted completely. The sweetness drained out of her voice, replaced by something cold and calculating. She talked about how tired I must be, carrying the burden of managing so much money at my age. She suggested that maybe it was time I stepped aside and let the younger generation handle things. She wasn't making conversation anymore. She was making a case for why I should give up control of everything Robert and I had worked for. She was positioning herself as the natural successor to manage our fortune, as if marriage to my son had somehow qualified her to make decisions about money she'd never helped earn. I started to respond, to remind her that the younger generation she was talking about had never held a job or demonstrated any understanding of financial responsibility. But before I could get the words out, she shoved me. Hard. The push was sudden, violent, and completely calculated. There was no anger in her face, no emotion at all. Just cold determination as she watched me fall backward into the lake. My body hit the freezing water with a shock that seized my lungs and sent panic racing through every nerve. For a moment, I thought I'd sink and never rise again. But as I struggled in that icy water, fighting to keep my head above the surface, I looked up and saw something that will haunt me forever. Vanessa was standing on the dock above me, her expression chillingly blank. No panic about my safety, no regret about what she'd done, no movement toward helping me or calling for aid. Just waiting. She was waiting for me to drown, standing there calmly, watching me struggle for my life, waiting for the lake to solve her problem permanently. In that moment of crystal clarity, I understood everything. This hadn't been an impulsive act of anger. This had been planned, calculated, a solution to the obstacle I represented to her financial ambitions. My daughter-in-law had just tried to murder me for $3 billion. But as I fought to stay afloat, as I kicked my way toward the shore with every ounce of strength I had left, one thought burned clear and bright in my mind. Vanessa had made a fatal miscalculation. She thought I'd go quietly into that cold water. She thought I'd drown without a fight. She thought a woman who'd built a billion-dollar empire from nothing would simply give up when things got dangerous. She had no idea what was coming next. But what Vanessa didn't know was that I hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by giving up when things got tough. And I certainly wasn't going to let some gold-digging daughter-in-law erase me for money she never earned. What would you have done in my shoes? Comment below, because what I did next changed everything. Getting to shore felt like the longest swim of my life. My clothes were waterlogged, dragging me down with every stroke. The cold water had shocked my system so completely that I could barely feel my limbs, but adrenaline kept me moving. I knew that if I stopped fighting, if I let myself sink even for a moment, Vanessa would get exactly what she wanted. When I finally dragged myself onto the muddy bank about 50 yards from our dock, I was shaking uncontrollably. Not just from the cold, but from the realization of what had just happened. My own daughter-in-law had tried to murder me. She had pushed me into that lake and stood there watching, waiting for me to drown so she could inherit billions of dollars without any messy legal complications. I sat there in the mud for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to process the magnitude of her betrayal. Water dripped from my hair, my clothes, my dignity. I felt older than I'd ever felt in my life, more vulnerable than I'd been since Robert died. But underneath the shock and the cold, something else was growing. Anger. Pure, focused rage at the audacity of what she'd tried to do. By the time I made it back to the house, Vanessa had already called Andrew and spun her version of events. I could hear her voice from the kitchen as I stood dripping in the entryway, telling him how worried she was about me, how I'd been acting strangely lately, how I'd simply lost my footing on the dock. She just slipped, honey, she was saying, her voice perfectly pitched with concern and confusion. I tried to grab her, but it happened so fast. I'm so worried about her balance lately. Maybe we need to talk about getting her some help. Some help. The woman who had just tried to kill me was already laying the groundwork to have me declared incompetent. When Andrew rushed into the entryway and saw me standing there soaked and shivering, his face was filled with genuine concern. But it wasn't concern about what had happened to me. It was concern about what was wrong with me. Vanessa had already poisoned the well, already planted the seeds of doubt about my mental state. Mom, what happened? Vanessa said you fell into the lake. I looked past him to where Vanessa stood in the kitchen doorway, her face a perfect mask of worried concern. But her eyes were different. Cold. Calculating. Watching to see if I would tell the truth, or if I'd learned to keep my mouth shut. I didn't fall, I said quietly. She pushed me. The silence that followed was deafening. Andrew looked between us, confusion and disbelief written across his face. Vanessa's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Satisfaction, maybe. She knew how this looked, a wet, shaken old woman making wild accusations against a young, beautiful daughter-in-law who had just called for help. Mom, that's impossible. Vanessa was trying to help you. She's the one who called me. Of course she called you. She needed witnesses to see her concern after she tried to drown me. Andrew's face crumpled with what looked like pain. Mom, please. You're upset. You're cold. You hit your head maybe when you fell. Vanessa would never hurt you. But I knew what I'd experienced. I knew the difference between falling and being pushed. I knew what I'd seen in her eyes as she watched me struggle in that water. The problem was, who would believe me? That night, lying in bed wearing 3 layers of clothes because I couldn't seem to get warm, I realized the full scope of my predicament. Vanessa had spent years positioning herself as the reasonable, caring daughter-in-law while subtly painting me as an aging matriarch who was becoming increasingly difficult and paranoid. Every time I'd express concerns about her, every time I'd questioned her motives, every time I'd made a decision she disagreed with, she'd been building a narrative about my declining mental state. The attempted murder hadn't been impulsive. It had been the culmination of a carefully planned campaign to discredit me, isolate me, and ultimately eliminate me. Over the following weeks, Vanessa's manipulation campaign went into overdrive. She started having quiet conversations with Andrew about my concerning behavior. She mentioned how I'd been confused during family dinners, how I'd been repeating myself lately, how I seemed to be having trouble keeping track of things. None of it was true, but she was clever about it. She never made direct accusations. Instead, she'd plant seeds of doubt, make concerned observations, ask leading questions about whether Andrew had noticed changes in me too. She was gaslighting both of us, making me question my own perceptions while making Andrew question my competency. Your mother seems to be getting paranoid in her old age, she'd say when she thought I couldn't hear. She's been making some really strange accusations lately. I'm worried about her. The word paranoid was particularly insidious. Every time I tried to tell Andrew what had really happened at the lake, every time I expressed concerns about Vanessa's behavior, I was proving her point. In her narrative, my legitimate fears about her became evidence of mental decline. She started suggesting that maybe I was showing early signs of cognitive decline, that memory issues might be affecting my judgment. When I'd forget where I'd put my reading glasses or couldn't remember which day of the week it was, she'd exchange meaningful glances with Andrew as if these normal aging moments were evidence of serious mental deterioration. Andrew, who loved both of us and desperately wanted to believe the best about everyone, began treating me differently, more carefully, as if I were fragile. He'd speak to me in the patient tone people use with children or elderly relatives who can't be trusted to understand complex situations. When I try to discuss business matters or family finances, he'd change the subject or suggest we talk about it later when you're feeling better. The family dynamic shifted so gradually that I almost didn't notice it happening. Sunday dinners became less frequent because Vanessa would suggest that large gatherings might be overwhelming for me. Holiday celebrations got simplified because the stress of planning might be too much for someone my age. Even my interactions with my grandchildren became supervised because their grandmother might get confused and say something inappropriate. I felt like I was disappearing from my own family, being erased one conversation at a time. The isolation was the worst part. When you're being gaslit by someone who's supposed to be family, when your own son starts questioning your grip on reality, you begin to doubt everything. Did I really see what I thought I saw at the lake? Was Vanessa's expression really as cold as I remembered, or had fear and shock distorted my perceptions? Was I becoming paranoid, seeing threats where none existed? But then I'd remember the feeling of her hands on my back, the deliberate force of that push, the calculated way she stood watching me struggle. That wasn't confusion or accident. That was attempted murder. The gaslighting campaign reached its crescendo when Andrew suggested I should see someone about my memory concerns. He presented it as a routine health checkup, something we should do proactively to make sure I was staying sharp as I aged. But I knew what he was really suggesting. A professional evaluation that could potentially be used to question my mental competency. Mom, There's no shame in getting a little help if things are becoming harder to manage, he said gently. Vanessa thinks it might be good for you to talk to someone professional about the stress you've been under. Of course, Vanessa thought that. A diagnosis of cognitive decline would be the perfect foundation for challenging my legal authority over the family finances. If I could be declared mentally incompetent, she and Andrew could assume control of everything Robert and I had built. But the final blow came when Andrew started limiting my access to my own grandchildren. He never said it directly, of course. Instead, there were always reasons why they couldn't visit, why family gatherings had to be postponed, why their schedules didn't align with mine. Vanessa would mention how the children had been confused by some things I'd said during our last visit, how they'd asked her questions about why Grandma seemed different lately. She was poisoning my relationship with the three people who mattered most to me in the world, using their innocence as a weapon against me. When 8-year-old Sarah asked why she couldn't visit Grandma anymore, Vanessa told her that Grandma needed to rest and get better before she could have company again. During this dark period, I found myself questioning everything about my life. Was I really the strong, capable woman I'd always believed myself to be? Was I losing my mind the way Vanessa suggested? Had my age finally caught up with me in ways I was too proud to admit? I'd sit in Robert's study, surrounded by the evidence of everything we'd built together, and wonder if I was strong enough to fight back against someone who was systematically destroying my credibility. Some days, the doubt was so overwhelming that I considered just giving up, signing over power of attorney to Andrew, and letting them handle everything. That would have been exactly what Vanessa wanted. But late one night, about 6 weeks after the lake incident, everything changed. I couldn't sleep again, so I went down to the kitchen to make tea. As I passed Andrew's old room, which Vanessa had converted into her personal office, I heard her voice through the door. She was on the phone, and she wasn't being careful about volume control. Maybe she thought I was asleep, or maybe she was just getting careless because her plan was working so well. But what I heard through that door made my blood run cold. The old woman is finally starting to crack, she was saying to whoever was on the other end of the call. Andrew's completely convinced that she's losing it. I think we can move to the next phase soon. I pressed my ear to the door, hardly breathing. No, she didn't drown, unfortunately, but that was always a long shot. The mental incompetency angle is working much better. Andrew's already talking about getting her evaluated, and once we have a professional diagnosis, we can get power of attorney transferred. My heart was pounding so loudly I was afraid she'd hear it through the door. The beauty of this approach is that she's doing half the work herself. Every time she tries to tell Andrew what really happened, she sounds more paranoid. Every time she questions my motives, she proves my point about her mental state. It's almost too easy. There was a pause while the person on the other end responded. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. I've done this before, remember? Richard was much harder to manage, but even he eventually signed everything over. And that car accident was genuinely unfortunate. I had nothing to do with that. Richard. She was talking about a man named Richard and a car accident and signing everything over. This wasn't her first time destroying someone for money. I stood outside that door for another 20 minutes, listening to her laugh about my declining mental state and make plans for how to spend her inheritance once the legal transfers were complete. She talked about the renovation she wanted to make to the house, the vacation property she wanted to buy, the social status she'd achieve once she had access to billions of dollars. But most chilling of all, she talked about me like I was already dead. Not dying, not sick, but dead. A problem that had been solved, an obstacle that had been removed. When I finally crept back to my room, my hands were shaking, but not from fear this time. From rage. From clarity. From the absolute certainty that I was not losing my mind, and I was not going to let this woman steal my life. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called James Morrison, the private investigator who had helped Whitmore Textiles deal with industrial espionage back in the early 90s. If Vanessa had done this before, if there was a Richard who had died in a car accident after signing everything over to her, there would be a paper trail. James, I need you to investigate someone for me. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa Whitmore. I need to know everything about her background, her previous relationships, her financial history. Everything. Mrs. Whitmore, is everything all right? I sound like a woman who's been gaslit for months by someone trying to steal my fortune. Can you help me or not? There was a pause. I'll start immediately. 3 days later, James called me back with a preliminary report that confirmed my worst suspicions. Vanessa's real name was Vanessa Chun, and she had a history of targeting wealthy older men. There had been 3 previous relationships that followed an identical pattern. Charm the target, isolate him from family and friends, gradually assume control of his finances, and then benefit from his convenient death. Richard Blackwood had been a 72-year-old widower worth about $8 million. He died in a single-car accident 6 months after signing over power of attorney to his loving girlfriend, Vanessa. The police investigation found no evidence of foul play, but several family members had expressed concerns about Vanessa's influence over Richard in the weeks before his death. Before Richard, there had been Harold Peterson, a retired pharmaceutical executive worth $12 million. Harold had died of an apparent heart attack in his sleep, just weeks after changing his will to leave everything to the wonderful woman who brought joy to his final years. Again, no evidence of foul play, but a suspicious pattern. The earliest case James could find was Marcus Webb, a real estate developer worth about $5 million. Marcus had died in what appeared to be an accidental drowning while vacationing with Vanessa at his lake house. She'd been the only witness, claiming he'd slipped and hit his head while they were walking on the dock. A lake house, a dock, an accidental drowning with only Vanessa as a witness. The pattern was unmistakable, and I was supposed to be victim number 4. But Vanessa had made a crucial mistake this time. She targeted a woman who had spent 40 years fighting corporate battles, who understood strategy and patience, who had resources and connections she'd never even suspected. As I sat in Robert's study reading through James's detailed report, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope, power. I knew who I was dealing with now. I understood her methods, her history, her weaknesses. Most importantly, I had proof that I wasn't crazy, that my instincts about her had been correct from the beginning. That night, I started making phone calls. First, I called David Chun, the family lawyer who had helped Robert and me structure our business and personal finances for over 2 decades. David had been more than our attorney. He'd been our friend, our confidant, someone who understood not just the legal implications of our decisions, but the personal values that drove them. David, I need your help with a sensitive situation. I believe my daughter-in-law is attempting to have me declared mentally incompetent so she can gain control of the family assets. David had known me for too long to dismiss my concerns as paranoia. Margaret, that's a very serious accusation. What evidence do you have? I told him everything. The lake incident, the gaslighting campaign, the overheard phone conversation, James's investigation into her background. David listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions, taking notes in the methodical way that had made him such an effective attorney. We need to act quickly, he said when I finished. If she's building a case for mental incompetency, we need to establish your cognitive competence clearly and unambiguously. I'm going to arrange for you to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation with Dr. Patricia Wells. She's the best forensic psychologist in the state, and her evaluations are bulletproof in court. Next, I reached out to my grandchildren. This was the most delicate part of my plan, because I didn't want to put them in the middle of an adult conflict, but I needed to know what Vanessa had been telling them about me. 8-year-old Sarah was the most talkative, and her innocent revelations were heartbreaking. Vanessa said you were sick, Grandma, and that's why we couldn't visit. She said we might make you more confused if we asked too many questions. She told Daddy that you've been saying strange things about her, and that we shouldn't believe everything you tell us because old people sometimes get mixed up. She said after you go to live in the special place for sick grandmas, we can visit you sometimes, but you probably won't remember who we are. The special place for sick grandmas. Vanessa was already planning to have me institutionalized. But I also learned something crucial from the children. They had witnessed several incidents that could support my version of events. Emma had seen Vanessa going through papers in my study when she thought no one was looking. James had overheard phone conversations where Vanessa talked about dealing with the old woman. Most importantly, Sarah had been watching from her bedroom window the day of the lake incident and had seen Vanessa standing on the dock for a really long time after I fell in. The children's observations wouldn't be admissible in court, but they confirmed that I wasn't imagining things, that there were witnesses to Vanessa's suspicious behavior. I also reconnected with several former business partners and employees who had worked with me for decades. These were people who knew my character, my competence, my mental acuity. If Vanessa tried to challenge my mental fitness, I wanted a chorus of respected voices ready to testify about my continued sharpness and capability. Margaret Santos, who had been my chief financial officer for 15 years, was particularly incensed when I explained what was happening. That woman has some nerve. Mrs. Whitmore, you're sharper than executives half your age. Anyone who's worked with you knows that your mind is as keen as ever. The investigation James was conducting grew more detailed and damning every day. He discovered that Vanessa had used multiple identities over the years, always targeting men who were wealthy, isolated, and vulnerable. She had a network of enablers, people who would vouch for her character, create false documents, provide alibis when necessary. Most disturbing of all, he found evidence suggesting that the accidents that had killed her previous victims might not have been accidental at all. Harold Peterson's heart attack had occurred shortly after he'd consumed a meal prepared exclusively by Vanessa, and traces of a rare plant toxin had been found in his system during the autopsy. The levels weren't high enough to prove poisoning, but they were suspicious. Richard Blackwood's car accident had happened on a road he'd driven thousands of times, on a clear day, with no apparent mechanical failures. But his vehicle's brake lines had been damaged in the crash, making it impossible to determine if they'd been sabotaged beforehand. Marcus Webb's drowning had all the hallmarks of my own experience. A woman claiming her companion had slipped and fallen, no other witnesses, suspicious delays in calling for help. James presented all of this information in a comprehensive report that painted a picture of a serial killer who used romantic relationships to access victims' wealth before murdering them in ways that looked accidental. I was looking at evidence of a predator who had refined her methods over years of practice. But having evidence and being able to use it effectively were two different things. Vanessa was smart, experienced, and she had already maneuvered herself into a position of trust with Andrew and the local community. I needed a plan that would not only expose her, but ensure that the exposure stuck. That's when David suggested something that seemed risky, but brilliant. Instead of immediately presenting our evidence to law enforcement, he recommended that we let Vanessa's plan proceed to a certain point while we gathered additional proof. If we could document her attempts to have me declared incompetent, record her admissions about her past crimes, and catch her in the act of trying to harm me again, we'd have an airtight case that no jury could ignore. It's dangerous, he admitted, but if we move too early, she might slip away like she has before. We need overwhelming evidence, not just suspicions and coincidences. The plan we developed was complex and required perfect timing. First, I would undergo the psychological evaluation to establish my mental competence beyond question. Then, I would appear to cooperate with Vanessa's gaslighting campaign, seeming to accept that maybe I was having memory problems, maybe I did need professional help. Meanwhile, James would continue investigating her background and building our evidence file. David would prepare legal documents that would protect the family assets regardless of what happened to me. And most crucially, we would set up surveillance in my own home to record Vanessa's real conversations and actions. The hardest part was pretending that her campaign was working. I had to act confused during family dinners, seem forgetful about important details, appear vulnerable and uncertain about my own perceptions. Every instinct I had rebelled against showing weakness to a predator, but I knew that her arrogance was my advantage. If Vanessa thought she was winning, she would get careless. If she believed I was broken down and helpless, she would reveal more of her true nature. And if she thought victory was within reach, she might make the kind of mistake that would destroy her completely. The surveillance equipment James installed was sophisticated and virtually undetectable. Cameras in common areas, audio recording devices in rooms where Vanessa spent time, monitoring software on computers and phones she had access to. Within a week, we had recorded dozens of conversations where she spoke freely about her plans for my money, her contempt for my family, and her satisfaction with how easily she was manipulating Andrew. But the most damning recording came when she thought I was at a charity board meeting, but had actually returned early due to a canceled appointment. I heard her on the phone in my own kitchen, speaking to someone about accelerating the timeline. The old woman is more resilient than I expected, she was saying. The mental decline angle is working, but it's taking too long. Andrew's starting to ask questions about why I'm so eager to get power of attorney transferred. I think it might be time for another accident. Another accident. She was planning to try to kill me again. The lake thing was amateur hour. Too many variables, too much chance for survival. I've learned from that mistake. This time, I'm thinking something that looks like natural causes. A heart attack, maybe, or a stroke. At her age, no one would question it. As I stood in my own hallway listening to my daughter-in-law plan my murder, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the early days of building Whitmore Textiles. The thrill of battle. The satisfaction of knowing that your opponent had just made a fatal error. Vanessa thought she was hunting a confused, helpless old woman. She had no idea that she was actually being stalked by someone with 40 years of experience in corporate warfare, unlimited resources, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The psychological evaluation Dr. Wells conducted was comprehensive and took nearly 6 hours. She tested my memory, cognitive function, decision-making abilities, and emotional stability. When the results came back, they showed that my mental acuity was not only intact, but actually above average for my age group. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Wells said as she reviewed her findings with me, you show no signs of cognitive decline, memory impairment, or compromised judgment. Your psychological profile suggests a highly intelligent, emotionally stable individual who is fully capable of making complex decisions about personal and financial matters. David made sure those results were properly documented and filed with the court system. If Vanessa tried to challenge my mental competence, she'd be fighting against professional medical testimony that proved exactly the opposite. Meanwhile, James's investigation had uncovered something even more valuable than Vanessa's criminal history. He'd found her current co-conspirators. The person she'd been talking to during those recorded phone conversations was a man named Derek Mills, who specialized in helping people disappear after committing financial crimes. Derek had assisted in the cover-ups of her previous victims' deaths and was already helping plan my demise. Better yet, Derek was sloppy about digital security. James had been able to access communications between him and Vanessa that detailed their entire operation, including backup plans if the mental incompetency angle didn't work fast enough. The evidence was overwhelming, but I still needed Vanessa to make one more mistake. I needed her to reveal her true nature in a way that would convince Andrew and ensure that no jury would ever believe her innocent act again. That's when I decided to give her exactly what she thought she wanted. I started acting more confused around the house, seeming to accept her suggestions that maybe I was having memory problems. I agreed to see a doctor about my concerns regarding my mental state, played along with her narrative that the stress of managing the family finances was becoming too much for me. The change in her behavior was immediate and dramatic. The more vulnerable I appeared, the bolder she became. She started spending larger amounts on my credit cards, decorating the house to her taste, making plans for renovations that would modernize the estate. She spoke more openly about her future plans, seeming to forget that I might be listening. Most tellingly, she started treating me with barely concealed contempt. The false sweetness disappeared, replaced by impatience and condescension. She'd interrupt me during conversations, dismiss my opinions as confused thinking, and generally treat me like an invalid whose presence was becoming inconvenient. Andrew noticed the change, but interpreted it as stress over my declining condition, rather than evidence of his wife's true character. Vanessa was careful to maintain her concerned act whenever he was around, but I could see the mask slipping more each day. Then I decided to test her reactions with a fake medical emergency. I called Andrew from my bedroom one evening, speaking in a confused, frightened voice about chest pains and difficulty breathing. He rushed home with Vanessa, genuinely terrified that his mother was having a heart attack. The paramedics arrived, conducted their evaluation, and determined that I was fine, just experiencing anxiety and stress. But while Andrew was focused on my medical condition, I was watching Vanessa's face. When the paramedics first arrived and began checking my vital signs, I saw something flash in her expression. Disappointment. She had been hoping that this was real, that her problem was solving itself naturally. Even more damning, when the paramedics determined that I was fine and didn't need to be hospitalized, I caught her exchanging glances with someone on her phone. She had been texting during the emergency, and from the angle I could see her screen, I knew she was communicating with Derek about the false alarm. The surveillance equipment recorded her phone conversation later that evening, when she thought I was sleeping soundly after the medical episode. Tonight was a perfect opportunity and it was wasted, she told Derek angrily. If she'd actually had a heart attack, this whole thing would be over. Now I'm going to have to manufacture something more reliable. Manufacture something. The woman was planning to murder me, and she was frustrated that I hadn't conveniently died on my own. But her anger made her careless, and carelessness was exactly what I needed. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa's behavior became increasingly reckless. She began leaving evidence of her research into methods of causing heart attacks in elderly people. She purchased items online that could be used to simulate natural death. Most importantly, she started making specific plans for my next accident, and she got sloppy about covering her digital tracks. James was able to access her computer files, which contained detailed research on undetectable poisons, methods of inducing cardiac arrest, and techniques for making murder look like natural causes. She had bookmarked websites about inheritance law, life insurance policies, and procedures for transferring assets after death. The evidence was now overwhelming. We had recordings of her planning my murder, digital evidence of her research into killing methods, financial records showing her systematic theft of my resources, and documented proof of her previous crimes. David assured me that we had enough evidence to guarantee her conviction on multiple charges. But I still wanted Andrew to see who he had married. I wanted him to witness her mask falling away completely, to understand that the woman he loved had been planning to murder his mother for money. Without that realization, even if Vanessa went to prison, our family would never truly heal from the damage she had caused. That's when I decided to arrange one final confrontation. I left a fake will where I knew Vanessa would find it, one that appeared to leave the entire $3 billion fortune directly to her and Andrew rather than in trust funds for the grandchildren. The will was legally meaningless. David had created it specifically as bait, but it looked official enough to fool someone who wasn't familiar with the state law. Vanessa took the bait immediately. Within days of discovering the will, her behavior changed completely. She became effusively sweet to me again, talking about how much she loved having me as part of the family, how grateful she was for everything Robert and I had built. But I could see the calculation in her eyes, the satisfaction of someone who believed victory was finally within reach. She also became impatient about my continued survival. If I was going to leave her billions of dollars, she wanted access to that money sooner rather than later. The fake will had accelerated her timeline, making her desperate enough to take risks she might otherwise have avoided. James's surveillance picked up her communications with Derek about moving to the final phase and eliminating the target within the next 2 weeks. She was done waiting for natural causes or gradual mental deterioration. She was ready to commit murder outright. That's when David and I contacted law enforcement. Detective Sarah Martinez of the County Sheriff's Department had handled financial crimes for over 15 years, and she immediately understood the scope of what we were dealing with. When she reviewed our evidence, the recordings, the digital files, the investigation into Vanessa's background, her reaction was immediate and decisive. Mrs. Whitmore, this woman is extremely dangerous. We need to move quickly to protect you while building our case for prosecution. Are you willing to cooperate with a sting operation? I had been waiting months for someone to ask me that question. The plan Detective Martinez developed was elegant in its simplicity. We would give Vanessa the opportunity she was waiting for, a chance to kill me without witnesses, in a way that would look accidental or natural. But this time, law enforcement would be watching and recording everything. We decided to recreate the lake scenario, since that was her preferred method, and she had probably been planning to try it again anyway. I would invite her for another walk to the dock, just the two of us, ostensibly to have a heart-to-heart conversation about family and the future. But this time, there would be hidden cameras recording everything, undercover officers positioned nearby, and medical personnel standing by to intervene if necessary. We would finally have video evidence of her attempting murder, along with whatever admission she might make before or during the attack. The risk was enormous. If anything went wrong, if the officers were too far away or the cameras malfunctioned, Vanessa might succeed in killing me for real this time. But I had spent my entire adult life taking calculated risks for high rewards, and this was the most important gamble I'd ever made. Detective Martinez arranged for the best surveillance equipment available, positioned officers throughout the woods surrounding our property, and coordinated with emergency medical services to ensure rapid response if needed. David prepared all the legal documentation to ensure Vanessa's arrest would lead to prosecution on the most serious charges possible. Most importantly, we arranged for Andrew to be present, but hidden during the confrontation. He needed to see his wife's true nature with his own eyes, needed to understand that everything I'd been telling him about her was true. Without his testimony about her character and behavior, a defense attorney might be able to paint Vanessa as a victim of circumstance rather than a calculating predator. Everything was in place. The evidence was overwhelming, the trap was set, and Vanessa was walking right into it. But I needed her to reveal her true nature one more time, on record with witnesses. Do you think family should come before money? Because what happened next proved that for some people, greed is stronger than blood. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon, just as Detective Martinez had predicted it would. Vanessa approached me with that same false sweetness she'd used months earlier, suggesting we take another walk down to the lake to clear the air between us. She said she'd been thinking about our relationship, about how much she valued having me as part of the family, and how she wanted to make sure we understood each other going forward. I almost laughed at the irony. Here was a woman who had tried to murder me in that exact location, now suggesting we return to the scene of her crime for what she undoubtedly intended to be a repeat performance. But this time I was ready for her. That sounds lovely, dear, I said, playing the role of the confused, trusting grandmother she thought I'd become. I'd like that very much. When were you thinking? How about this Sunday afternoon? Andrew has that work call he can't miss, so it would just be the two of us. We could really talk without any distractions. Of course, Andrew would be conveniently unavailable. Just like last time, Vanessa was following her established playbook, creating the same conditions that had nearly worked before. But she had no idea that Andrew wouldn't actually be on a work call. He'd be hidden in the woods with Detective Martinez, finally witnessing his wife's true nature. The days leading up to Sunday felt like the longest of my life. James positioned his surveillance equipment throughout the property, invisible cameras that would capture everything from multiple angles. Detective Martinez briefed her team on their positions and response protocols. David prepared the legal documents that would freeze Vanessa's access to any family assets the moment she was arrested. Most importantly, we made sure my grandchildren were safe and far away from what was about to unfold. They were staying with Robert's sister for the weekend, told only that Grandma and Daddy had some important family business to handle. I couldn't bear the thought of them witnessing their stepmother's arrest, but I also knew they needed to understand, eventually, why she would no longer be part of their lives. Andrew was the hardest part of the preparation. He still didn't know the full extent of what we'd discovered about his wife. Detective Martinez had insisted that his reactions needed to be genuine. If he knew in advance what Vanessa was planning, he might inadvertently tip her off or compromise the operation. All he knew was that there were serious concerns about Vanessa's intentions toward me and that law enforcement needed him to be nearby during our lakeside conversation. He was confused and worried, still hoping that somehow there had been a misunderstanding, that the woman he loved couldn't possibly be capable of what we were suggesting. I felt heartbroken for him. In a few hours, his entire world was going to collapse. The wife he adored, the life he'd built, the future he'd imagined, all of it was about to be revealed as an elaborate deception. But I also knew that living with the truth, however painful, was better than living with a lie that could eventually cost him his life too. Sunday afternoon arrived with perfect spring weather. Sunny, mild, with a gentle breeze rippling across the lake. Under different circumstances, it would have been ideal for a peaceful walk with family. Instead, It was the perfect setting for a trap that had been months in the making. Vanessa appeared in the kitchen wearing a sundress and sandals, looking like she was ready for a pleasant family outing rather than a murder. Her demeanor was relaxed, confident, almost cheerful. She was clearly excited about what she thought was going to happen, barely able to contain her anticipation of finally eliminating the last obstacle to her inheritance. "Ready for our walk, Margaret?" she asked, and I noticed she dropped the usual mom she used when Andrew was around. Small signs that her act was already beginning to slip. "Yes, dear. I'm looking forward to our conversation." As we walked toward the lake, I could feel the invisible presence of law enforcement officers positioned throughout the woods. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, watching, recording, ready to intervene if Vanessa succeeded in pushing me into the water again. The knowledge that I wasn't truly alone gave me strength, but it didn't eliminate the fear. This woman had already tried to kill me once, and she was about to do it again. The dock looked exactly the same as it had months earlier, weathered with stretching out over the calm water, the same spot where I'd nearly drowned while my daughter-in-law watched with cold satisfaction. But this time, I wasn't a confused victim stumbling into a trap. I was a woman with a plan, armed with knowledge and protected by people who believed in justice. "It's so peaceful here," Vanessa said as we reached the end of the dock. "I can see why you love this property so much." Her tone was conversational, almost nostalgic, as if we were just two family members enjoying a pleasant afternoon together. But I could see something different in her posture, a subtle tension that suggested she was preparing for action. "Yes, Robert and I spent many happy hours here," I replied, positioning myself carefully so the cameras would have clear sight lines. He used to say this dock was his favorite place to think through difficult decisions. "Difficult decisions," she repeated, and something in her voice had changed. The false warmth was fading, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "Speaking of difficult decisions, Margaret, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your future." Here it comes, I thought. The mask was about to fall away completely. "What kind of conversation, dear?" Vanessa turned to face me directly, and for the first time in months, I saw her genuine expression. No fake concern, no manipulative sweetness, just cold calculation and barely contained contempt. "The kind of conversation where we stop pretending that you're not becoming a burden to this family," she said, her voice dropping to a harder tone. "The kind where we acknowledge that your time is running out, one way or another." I felt my heart rate accelerate, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." "Oh, I think you understand perfectly. You've been playing the confused old woman act for weeks now, but I know you're sharper than you pretend. You know exactly what I'm talking about." She stepped closer, and I could see the predator that had been hiding behind her beautiful facade for years. "You remember our last walk down here, don't you, Margaret? When you had that unfortunate accident and ended up in the lake." My blood ran cold, but this was exactly what Detective Martinez had hoped for, a clear admission that the previous incident hadn't been an accident. "That wasn't an accident," I said quietly. Vanessa laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Of course it wasn't an accident. I pushed you into that water and stood here watching, hoping you'd finally do everyone a favor and drown. Unfortunately, you turned out to be a better swimmer than I expected." There it was, a complete confession to attempted murder, recorded by multiple cameras and witnessed by law enforcement officers who were close enough to intervene if necessary. But she wasn't done talking. "You have no idea how frustrating it's been, waiting for you to die naturally. Do you know how long I've been planning this? How many years I've wasted being the perfect daughter-in-law, pretending to care about your boring charity work and your outdated values." Her composure was completely gone now, replaced by pure venom. "I've been watching you hoard that money like some kind of dragon, throwing millions away on people who don't deserve it while I have to beg Andrew for every dollar I spend. $3 billion, Margaret. $3 billion that should be mine, locked away by a selfish old woman who's too stubborn to die." I had never heard such raw hatred in another person's voice. This wasn't just about money. It was about everything she felt entitled to, everything she believed I was keeping from her. "The trust funds for the grandchildren were the last straw," she continued, pacing now like a caged animal. locking away my inheritance in accounts I'll never be able to touch, with conditions and restrictions and moral guidelines. As if you have any right to control how money gets spent after you're dead. It's not your money, Vanessa. It never was. Her eyes flashed with fury. It absolutely is my money. I've earned it by putting up with your family for 10 years. I've earned it by pretending to love your pathetic son. I've earned it by smiling through 1,000 boring dinners and pretending to care about your stupid stories about the good old days. The cruelty in her voice when she talked about Andrew was breathtaking. This woman had spent a decade manipulating and deceiving the man who loved her, and she saw it as work she deserved to be compensated for. Andrew loves you, I said, though even as I said it, I knew how naive it sounded. Andrew is a means to an end. A sweet, gullible means to a very profitable end. Do you think I would have wasted 10 years of my life with him if he wasn't the heir to a fortune? Please, I've had 3 other loving relationships just like this one, and they all ended the same way. 3 other relationships. She was confessing to the murders James had uncovered, admitting to a pattern of targeting and killing wealthy men for their money. What happened to them, Vanessa? Her smile was chilling. Accidents happen to old people, Margaret. Heart attacks, car crashes, drowning incidents. Tragic, but not unexpected when you reach a certain age. She was describing murder as casually as someone might discuss the weather. Richard was the hardest one. He was actually starting to suspect something toward the end, asking too many questions about my background. But even he signed over power of attorney eventually. A little bit of the right medication in his evening coffee, and he became much more cooperative about financial decisions. You poisoned him. I helped him make the right choice about his legacy. Just like I'm going to help you make the right choice about yours. She stepped even closer, and I could see the intention in her eyes. She was done talking. It was time for action. The difference is, Margaret, you don't get the option of signing papers and dying peacefully in your sleep. You've been too difficult, too stubborn, too suspicious. You're going to have another accident, and this time I'm going to make sure you don't swim to shore. I started to back away from her, but there wasn't much room at the end of the dock. People will wonder about 2 accidents in the same location, I said, stalling for time. No, they won't. Because I've spent months establishing that you're having mental problems, that you're becoming confused and unstable. When they find your body in the lake, everyone will assume you wandered down here alone and fell in because you were disoriented. Andrew will be heartbroken, of course, but he'll also be grateful that I was there to support him through his grief. She was describing a complete plan, not just my murder, but the cover-up that would follow. I'll be the devoted widow, helping my husband cope with the loss of his mother while we work together to manage the family fortune. The fortune that will finally belong to me. You'll never get away with this. I've gotten away with it 3 times before. I'm very good at playing the grieving girlfriend, Margaret. I'm very good at being the survivor who's just grateful to be alive when tragedy strikes someone else. That's when she lunged at me. But this time I was ready. Instead of trying to resist her push, I let myself fall backward off the dock while grabbing onto her wrist. The move surprised her. She'd expected me to fight to stay on the dock, not to pull her into the water with me. We both hit the lake with a splash, but this time I wasn't alone and helpless. This time, Detective Martinez and her team were already running toward the shore, having seen everything they needed to see. I surfaced quickly, helped by the life jacket I'd hidden under my loose shirt. Vanessa came up sputtering and furious, immediately trying to push me back under the water. But before she could get a grip on me, strong hands were pulling both of us toward shore. Police, stop fighting and move toward the bank. Vanessa's face went white as she saw the officers emerging from the woods, as she realized that her perfect plan had been a trap all along. But even then, she tried to maintain her story. Thank God you're here. Margaret fell in again. I was trying to save her. But Detective Martinez had been wearing a wire, had recorded every word of Vanessa's confession. Vanessa Chen, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud, she said as officers handcuffed a dripping, shivering Vanessa. You have the right to remain silent. From the woods, I saw Andrew emerge, his face a mask of shock and horror. He had heard everything. His wife's confession to trying to kill me, her admission that their entire marriage had been a lie, her casual discussion of murdering 3 other people for their money. The man I'd raised from a baby was learning that the woman he'd loved and trusted had been planning to murder his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking as he reached me. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you." As Vanessa was loaded into a police car, still screaming about how this was all a misunderstanding, how she'd been taken out of context, how she'd never hurt anyone, Detective Martinez began explaining the evidence they'd gathered. "We have recordings of her planning your murder, digital evidence of her research into killing methods, financial records showing systematic theft, and documented proof of her involvement in at least 3 previous suspicious deaths. Mrs. Whitmore, this woman is going to prison for the rest of her life." But the most important evidence was what Andrew had witnessed with his own eyes and ears. His wife's mask falling away completely, her admission that she tried to kill me, her callous discussion of murdering other people for money. No defense attorney would be able to convince him that Vanessa was innocent, that she'd been misunderstood or wrongly accused. The investigation that followed moved swiftly. James's months of research provided law enforcement with everything they needed to build cases in multiple jurisdictions. Vanessa was charged with attempted murder in my case, but authorities in 3 other states opened investigations into the suspicious deaths of Richard Blackwood, Harold Peterson, and Marcus Webb. Her financial assets were immediately frozen, preventing her from accessing any money she'd stolen or manipulated from her victims. The elaborate lifestyle she'd built on other people's wealth disappeared overnight, replaced by a jail cell and orange prison clothing. Andrew filed for divorce before she was even formally charged, unwilling to maintain any legal connection to a woman who had tried to murder his mother. The man who had defended her for months, who had suggested I might need professional help when I tried to warn him about her true nature, became the prosecution's most powerful witness. The media attention was intense, but relatively brief. Serial gold digger arrested for multiple murders was the kind of story that fascinated people for a few weeks before being replaced by the next scandal. But for our family, the coverage served an important purpose. It warned other potential victims about Vanessa's methods and made it impossible for her to disappear and reinvent herself somewhere else. The trial took place 8 months later, and it was even more damning than I had expected. Derek Mills, her co-conspirator, had agreed to testify against her in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the systematic way Vanessa had targeted vulnerable wealthy men, the network of people who had helped her forge documents and create false identities, and the specific methods she'd used to kill her previous victims. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and as the evidence from other states was incorporated into the case, multiple counts of murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling her a predator who used charm and manipulation to steal not just money, but lives from people who trusted her. As the sentence was read, Vanessa finally showed genuine emotion, not remorse for her victims, but fury at being caught and punished. She screamed at me from across the courtroom as bailiffs led her away. "This isn't over, Margaret. You can't keep what's mine forever." But it was over. Completely, permanently over. The aftermath of Vanessa's conviction brought a peace to our family that I hadn't realized we'd lost. Andrew and I spent hours talking through everything that had happened, processing the deception he'd lived with for years, working to rebuild the trust that Vanessa had systematically undermined. "I should have listened to you," he said during one of our many conversations. "I should have seen what she was doing. She was very skilled at manipulation," I reminded him. "That's how she succeeded for so long. You loved her, and love makes us want to see the best in people." My grandchildren were remarkably resilient in processing the changes to our family. We told them age-appropriate versions of what had happened, that Vanessa had made very bad choices and wouldn't be living with us anymore, that sometimes people pretend to be good when they're really not, that the important thing was that our family was safe now. Emma, my 12-year-old granddaughter, surprised me with her insight. "Grandma, I never really liked how she talked about money all the time. It made me uncomfortable. Why didn't you say anything, sweetheart?" I thought maybe that was just how grown-ups were supposed to talk. But it didn't feel right. Even children can sense authentic character versus manipulation, I realized. Vanessa had fooled the adults in her life, but the children had maintained their instinct about her true nature. With Vanessa gone and her threat permanently eliminated, I was finally able to establish the trust funds for my grandchildren properly. Not the fake will I'd use to bait Vanessa, but a real, carefully structured plan that would provide for their education and futures while teaching them about responsibility and giving back to the community. I also resumed my philanthropic work with renewed purpose. The experience with Vanessa had reminded me how important it is to use wealth responsibly, to support causes that matter, to remember that money is a tool for creating positive change rather than just accumulating luxury. The literacy program we funded expanded to serve over 5,000 children. The Veteran Housing Initiative built its 100th home. The scholarship fund sent its 1,000th student to college. Every dollar we gave away was a dollar that couldn't be hoarded by someone who would use it selfishly. But most importantly, our family was whole again. Sunday dinners resumed. Holiday celebrations returned to their traditional warmth, and my grandchildren were back in my life completely. The house that had felt tense and uncomfortable during Vanessa's manipulation campaign became a home again. Andrew found love, eventually with someone who valued him for his character rather than his inheritance. Sarah, a teacher who had never heard of the Whitmore fortune when they met, who fell in love with my son's kindness and intelligence rather than his bank account. Their wedding 2 years later was everything a wedding should be, a celebration of genuine love rather than a financial transaction. The security system James installed remained active, and I maintained some of the safety precautions we developed during the investigation. When you've been targeted once by someone willing to kill for money, you never completely lose the awareness that there might be others out there with similar intentions. But I also learned something important about my own strength. Vanessa had tried to make me doubt my perceptions, question my sanity, and accept that I was too old and weak to protect myself and my family. She had almost succeeded in making me believe that I was helpless. The truth was exactly the opposite. The skills that had helped Robert and me build a billion-dollar business, strategic thinking, careful planning, the ability to read people's true motivations, had served me well in protecting our family from a predator. Age had made me vulnerable. Experience had made me formidable. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm struck by how completely Vanessa misunderstood the situation. She saw an aging woman with more money than she could spend, someone who seemed kind and trusting, someone who might be easily manipulated or eliminated. What she failed to recognize was that kindness isn't weakness, that trust doesn't equal stupidity, and that someone who built a fortune from nothing isn't likely to give it up without a fight. She thought she was hunting prey, but she had actually made an enemy of someone with the resources, intelligence, and determination to destroy her completely. Every move she made to isolate me and discredit me had actually helped build the case against her. Every lie she told had been recorded, every manipulation documented, every crime preserved as evidence. Her greed was her downfall, but it was more than that. It was her assumption that other people existed solely for her benefit, that their lives and relationships and achievements were just tools for her advancement. She saw my family as a collection of assets to be acquired rather than human beings to be respected. That fundamental lack of empathy, that inability to see other people as real, was what made her both dangerous and ultimately self-destructive. She couldn't understand that love and loyalty and trust were more powerful than fear and manipulation, and that understanding cost her everything. The legal system worked exactly as it was supposed to. Evidence was gathered carefully, rights were protected, due process was followed, and justice was ultimately served. Vanessa received a fair trial and was convicted by a jury of her peers based on overwhelming evidence of her crimes. She's now serving life in prison, unable to harm anyone else. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about the elaborate trap we set for her, if I think we should have simply gone to the police with our suspicions rather than giving her the opportunity to attempt murder again. But I know that without video evidence of her actually trying to kill me, without recordings of her confessing to previous murders, she might have found a way to escape justice like she had before. She was intelligent, experienced, and had spent years perfecting her methods. Half measures wouldn't have been enough to stop her permanently. She needed to be caught in the act, recorded confessing to her crimes, exposed completely so that no jury could doubt her guilt. The revenge I got wasn't the kind you see in movies. It wasn't about getting even or making her suffer. It was about protecting my family and ensuring that justice was served. The best revenge is sometimes just making sure the legal system works properly, that evidence is preserved and presented clearly, that the truth comes out completely. Vanessa thought she could drown me in that lake and walk away with $3 billion. Instead, she drowned herself in her own greed. And me, I just smiled as the handcuffs clicked shut. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people destroy themselves. You just have to be patient enough to watch it happen. Have you ever had to deal with someone who tried to take what wasn't theirs? How did you handle it? Share your stories in the comments below. And remember, subscribe if you believe that justice always finds a way.